Okay. Focusing on recording, and we can go forward and back there. Thank you. Is that okay? Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the last Stapledon Colloquium of the season. We're running a little bit late, so without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Soren Bayasu from the University of Kiel, who will be talking to us about philosophical practice as first philosophy. Please welcome Professor Bayasu. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Nikos. Thank you, Michael, and everybody who's here for having me. As mentioned in the session we had before with the master's and PhD students, this is my first paper in the area of philosophical counseling, and I have to thank for this in part, of course, you for inviting me here, but also my third-year students with whom I discussed some of these problems. I've been teaching philosophical counseling at Kiel for about 3-4 years, and the discussion with the students was throughout the years very fruitful. I'm going to use this PowerPoint, but I'm aware of the advantages and disadvantages of using PowerPoint. And just in order to make sure that you are following or that you don't get bored, please, if you have any questions while I'm talking, please let me know. Put your hand up and let me know. I know that there is a session for questions and discussion at the end. So what I plan to do is, if there is a question which I can quickly answer, or perhaps which will be answered during my talk, I say that. Otherwise, I'll make a note and answer it during the Q&A. Right, so here is the outline. I'm going to say a bit about philosophical practice or philosophical counseling, and then I'm going to compare philosophical practice and academic philosophy. As you will see, one claim is that philosophical counseling is part of the helping professions, so has a kind of is useful in a kind of pragmatic way, in a way in which academic philosophy is not. And in order to clarify the practical character of philosophical counseling, I'm going to focus on the account offered by Gerd Achenbach, the first person to open a philosophical practice. And I'm going to talk a bit about his account of the practical character of philosophical counseling, which is going to lead us in a smooth way to the claim that philosophical practice or counseling has some priority over academic philosophy. And I'm going to say a bit more about what that amounts to. And then I move then on to some of the methodological implications of this primacy for philosophical counseling, and I will end up with some conclusions. Here is a standard definition of philosophical counseling offered by Payden. He says philosophical counseling is that helping profession which seeks to understand critically the ideas and worldviews associated with the client's life problems. So it's part of the helping professions. Helping professions are in general professions which attempt to assist, and then they call them either clients or visitors or counselees or patients to assist them in solving their life problems. And these life problems usually lead to inabilities to work, to care for themselves, to engage in lasting relationships. Or there might be concerns, more general concerns, that would not allow them to function as well as they think they could. The two helping professions most closely related to philosophical counseling are psychotherapy and pastoral counseling. We can, in addition, distinguish philosophical counseling from traditional or academic philosophy. This doesn't count, of course, as a helping profession, but counts as an academic discipline. There are various debates on the links between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy or pastoral counseling. That's not going to be my focus. My main focus will be on the relation of philosophical counseling to academic philosophy. Now, one way in which academic philosophy can be defined is in terms of its results. Obviously, there are so many debates in meta-philosophy about the nature of philosophy. Perhaps it's easier if we were to define academic philosophy in terms of its results, rather than trying to focus on things like the nature of philosophy. And it seems that what we do as academic philosophers is to produce self-reflective knowledge. We study, we teach, and then we produce and disseminate a particular type of reflective knowledge. Philosophy is not the only discipline which produces this kind of reflective knowledge. That's why it's regarded usually as part of the humanities, where again, reflective knowledge is produced. But we usually distinguish between philosophy as part of humanities and other branches of humanities, depending on methods, tools, media. Okay, now in general, these results of humanistic reflections, the self-reflective knowledge that is produced, is considered intrinsically valuable, but is usually considered to have little practical value or little direct practical value. And of course, we are trying more to do in the last few years to demonstrate the impact of humanities. Not sure whether the best method for assessing this is what is done as part of REC, but that's something that motivates us to think also of the practical relevance of our discipline and humanities in general. But there is a clear difference between the disciplines of humanities and the self-reflective knowledge they produce, and the practical usefulness or pragmatic usefulness of helping professions such as pastoral counseling or psychotherapy. So there is here a marked difference. Now, the way in which we can understand the intrinsic value of these disciplines is by the supposed universal character of this self-reflective knowledge that is produced, and the supposed universal character of the problems that philosophers, academic philosophers, attempt to address and answer. These problems are thought to appeal to all people, at least those who are able to engage reflectively in philosophical debates. So they are supposed to be of universal relevance. And in general, this desire for self-reflective knowledge is not expected to be function of any particular situation or life problem. Even in areas such as applied ethics, where we seem to focus on specific problems, we focus on those problems not in relation to any particular individual's concerns or life problems. We focus on a specific area, which is supposed to be, again, potentially of relevance to everybody. And of course, there is the institutional setting, which is specific for academic philosophy and other humanistic disciplines. We teach these in universities, colleges to students, and we usually can teach them to persons who are sufficiently mature to be able to undertake this self-reflective process. Although, of course, the movement such as philosophy for children extends this also beyond what we would consider to be appropriate for a philosophy module, for instance, in a university. Okay, so traditional academic philosophy, one possible way of describing it is as a subdiscipline in the humanities that seeks to develop and promulgate a particular kind of intrinsically valuable, universal, not primarily directed as usefulness in the pragmatic sense, self-reflective knowledge through the use of standard philosophical methods, such as detailed phenomenological description, conceptual and existential analysis, or logical argument. So this is the part where, by mentioning the tools used by philosophers, we can distinguish philosophy from other disciplines within humanities. Now, to compare philosophical counseling or philosophical practices and academic philosophy, there are, of course, some similarities. They are similar with regards to the self-reflective character of the knowledge that they produce or that they use. So philosophy, academic philosophy would produce this kind of self-reflective knowledge, whereas philosophical practice or counseling would use it for its particular purposes. Where they distinguish themselves from each other, academic philosophy and philosophical counseling, is in the use to which this knowledge is put and the different points of focus that they need as a result. So philosophical counseling doesn't seek the general philosophical edification of all interested mature people, but seeks specific philosophical insights for specific individuals and for their specific problems. Of course, we might have as clients or visitors or patients not an individual, but a group, or sometimes even several groups as part of an institution. But even in those cases, what is of interest is a specific concrete problem that is a life problem for that group, individual, or institution. And what philosophical counseling does is to use philosophical methods to help clients to reflect critically on the ideas and worldviews associated with their problems. And also, they try to reflect on the concrete consequences for the lives of the clients. So, philosophical counselors would use the same methods as academic philosophers. They would produce the same type of self-reflective knowledge. However, those methods and knowledge are of interest to clients because of the specific, sometimes singular, actual problems that clients have, and not because of the general relevance the problems have, for instance, for the human condition, as is the case for academic philosophy. Now, there are various ways in which we can understand this pragmatic usefulness of philosophical counseling. And one way in which this is sometimes done is by a distinction within philosophical counseling between so-called edification approaches in philosophical counseling and problem-solving approaches or strategies. And those approaches in philosophical counseling, which are part of the edification strategy, they claim that their interest is not particularly in solving some specific life problems, but in making the lives of the clients more meaningful, in helping them to transform, in helping them to develop. By contrast, the problem-solving strategy, the approaches that use this strategy claim explicitly that their starting point are singular practical concerns that clients have. What I would like to do is to focus now on a particularly interesting account of the practical sense of philosophical counseling or philosophical practice that is offered by Georg Achenbach, who, as mentioned, was first to open a practice of philosophical counseling in 1981. So I will focus on his account of philosophical counseling. And as we will see in his attempt to account for this practical sense of philosophical counseling, Achenbach also arrives at the conclusion that suggests the primacy of philosophical counseling over academic philosophy. In other words, the claim is that to do philosophy properly, we should choose the avenue of philosophical counseling. That is, to do philosophy properly, we should do it through philosophical counseling. So let's see how Achenbach gets to this point. So he's influenced by a distinction formulated by Wolfgang Wieland in a book on Plato between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. This distinction is taken to be similar to the distinction between knowing how and knowing that. And of course, there is a lot of literature on this distinction. And there are a lot of questions to be raised about the distinction. Achenbach prefers to use, instead of knowing how, he prefers to use knowing about. So the idea is that theoretical knowledge is knowledge about facts. Practical knowledge is that knowledge which allows us to put ourselves into a certain relation to these facts. So it's not simply knowing about certain things, but allowing us to do something with those facts. And that requires some knowledge. And the idea is that in dealing with difficulties, such as life's risks, that's Achenbach's example, we do not ask, what do I know about these difficulties, but what kind of stance can I take towards these difficulties? And what is expected is some kind of reasonable attitude towards these difficulties, rather than what could objectively be said about them. So it's this kind of practical stance that Achenbach has in mind. So the content of communication in philosophical practice, Achenbach claims, is not propositional knowledge, but non-propositional knowledge. Now, he wants to link this non-propositional practical kind of knowledge with the purpose of philosophical counseling. He thinks that philosophical counseling is the striving for practical wisdom. Of course, it's easy. You go to the etymology of philosophy and then you end up with love of wisdom. What philosophical counseling is also trying to find practical wisdom. And he says, I maintain that in philosophical practice, philosophy as practical wisdom, I think there is a typo, should be comes back to itself, or as philosophical practice, philosophy renews its primacy and original impulse in order to fulfill it in a new territory. He thinks that what philosophy sought from the beginning in the ancient traditions was not primarily pure knowledge, but a conscious condition and form of life, kind of a way to lead a good life. And that he thinks that philosophical practice goes back to this ancient tradition of an effort to learn how to live or how to care for the soul. And wisdom, the kind of practical knowledge that we hope to achieve, allegedly, philosophers tried to achieve, and they might still try if they follow this authentic path of philosophy. It's a kind of awakening from everyday thoughtlessness and becoming aware of oneself in order to achieve a life that each individual is leading and that each individual can accept or agree with. So, whereas propositional knowledge are usually framed as statements whose truth doesn't depend on who states them, this non-propositional knowledge of knowing how or knowing about is the knowledge of the wise person, is the knowledge of someone who knows. It becomes part of the constitution of a particular person, is, as Ahambach says, incarnated knowledge which is witnessed by a certain way of life. It doesn't express itself in statements. And although it doesn't express itself in statements, nevertheless, of course, we use statements to speak about it. So propositional knowledge is claimed and justified, whereas we cannot really give an account, a proper account of this non-propositional knowledge. It is the knowledge of the person with wisdom. And it's knowledge which is not only shaped by the person who knows, but which also shapes this person into being the wise person they are supposed to be. So the practical effect of this authentic sense of philosophy is supposed to be obtained not by conveying, not merely by conveying knowledge of facts, of course, this is part of it, but by providing insights. So philosophy changes the person who gains insights, and it is in this sense practical, and it is in this sense that we should understand the practical character of philosophical counseling as this capacity to change the person who gains these insights with the help of the reflection that is encouraged by philosophy. And as the person is changed with the help of these insights, things appear to this person in a different light. Things start to be seen in a different way, with different eyes. So what philosophical practice is an exchange of insights between the counselor and the counselee, but not merely as a kind of back and forth of opinions and theoretical claims. Rather, the visitor or counselee's insights are examined, evaluated, challenged, developed, broadened, deepened, sometimes dramatized, sometimes diminished, sometimes modified. It's a matter of a practical effect that philosophical counseling has on individuals, primarily the counselee, but also the counselor. So the idea is that in this way, visitor counseling changes. Although for Ahambach, that's not important. So for him, it's not simply changed by itself, but more a clarification of these philosophical insights, which are acquired by the person who gains wisdom in this way, and hence becomes more and more a philosopher in the sense of love of wisdom. Okay. Now, Ahambach tries to see which philosophical traditions would be best to link philosophical practice with. And he starts as a possibility with the Stoic tradition and starts with the Greek-Roman Stoics, who take wisdom to be the kind of highest idea of human perfection. To talk about the wise person. However, Ahambach thinks that this connection is very difficult to sustain today. It's mainly to do, Ahambach invokes here specific doctrines, Stoic doctrines, but at the time he was writing, he wasn't aware, for instance, of the success of this movement, which happened during the last few years of, I don't know whether you are aware of it, the live like a Stoic for 1 week. It's a movement generated by a few philosophers who created this. Initially, there was something like a camp where people would meet, but then became a hybrid enterprise. And every year, this happens within a particular week, and people either join online or actually meet and try to be like a story for 1 week and see what kind of insights they gain from this. Very, very successful, and it carries on. So Stoicism perhaps might have more to say to us than Achenbach thought it would. There are also some attempts in philosophy, for instance, in political philosophy, to offer Stoic liberal theories. There is a bit more to be said in support of Stoicism. However, what Achenbach eventually does is to mainly support the link between philosophical counseling and Pyrrhonian skepticism. He thinks that the history of philosophy shows that all the vigorous attempts to gain eternally true knowledge of the eternal truth and to prevent all damaging doubts have failed. So he thinks that perhaps the best thing to do for philosophical counseling is to connect it with Pyrrhonian skepticism. He relies on skepticism as a practical doctrine or as a practical theory. He's not so much concerned with the skeptical doubts, radical skeptical doubts of people like Pyrrho. He is more concerned with the practical implications of those doubts. So the idea is to renounce the attempt to reach certainty. Pyrrhonian skeptics thought that even the best human beings, in their search for truth, always confront uncertainties and doubts. So the goal of Pyrrhonists is a wisdom as a life where the indeterminacy of the question of truth is accepted, thus reaching unperturbedness and tranquility of mind by suspension of judgment. Well, that's usually how Pyrrhonists function. They question the particular claim of a dogmatic philosopher. They try to find a claim equally strong but opposed, and because of the balance between, but also opposition between the two claims, they eventually decide to suspend judgment and reach mental tranquility. So Achenbach says, wisdom connects with the hidden truth, which invites us to carefulness and modesty and not to an obvious and supposedly valid truth, which would lead to dogmatism and the clouding of perception. And the virtue of the wise, in terms of the Pyrrhonian skeptics, is this notion of epoche. So the idea that among the multitude of opinions, not to try to decide in favor of one's own conviction, but rather to view one's own conviction from the perspective of the other, and to postpone the decision, keeping the judgment suspended. Achenbach next tries to find a modern skeptic. He thinks Montaigne is a good skeptic, who perhaps is also a good model for the philosophical counselor. And again, he thinks that whereas there is a epistemic modesty that is advocated by skeptics, this doesn't mean complete withdrawal of the person. On the contrary, it just means affirmation of the subjectivity of the counselor and also that of the visitor. And again, this is not a denial of truth and assertion of arbitrariness. It's just the idea of rejecting the fact that a life-guiding truth must be non-subjective. And that particularly because the questions that a counselor is trying to address together with the counselee are very specific, singular questions for a particular individual in very particular circumstances. Some suggestions that Montaigne is indeed a good model for a philosophical counselor, at least according to Achenbach. Montaigne says, I do not want to say what should happen in the world. There are enough others to do so. What I want to say is what I am doing. And again, on Montaigne's account, life, with all its vagueness, is the primary substance on which all philosophical reflection follows. So the idea is not that of living as it is taught philosophically, but thinking over philosophically that which is lived. So the question is not what should I do, but what am I doing? And there is then also a discussion about the link between life and philosophy, and the idea is that life should be approached to begin with, not through philosophical lenses, because life is that which is supposed to be the ground on the basis of which philosophy starts to form through reflection. So rather than trying to perceive life through a philosophical lens, which would mean to end up with a reduced life, we should start with life and then get to philosophy. Similarly, as a result, the counselor shouldn't try to tell the visitor how they should live, but just to make them know themselves and their own way of living. So make them aware of their own lives through self-reflection. That's going to be done through an uncensored encouragement for the counselee to present their problems, not trying to intervene, at least to begin with, giving voice to those parts which don't seem to be worth. The counselor always should encourage the counselee to express everything, even if it doesn't seem worth. A judgment on what is worth and what is not worth shouldn't precede the story about the problem that the counselee has, but it should only follow. Now, that has some methodological implications. For instance, it's very interesting the form in which Achenbach presents his text. He presents his text. This text is a text he uses as a keynote for a conference on philosophical counseling. And in this text, although he reflects on the nature of philosophical counseling and the philosophical traditions to which we can link philosophical counseling, he nevertheless presents it in the form of a dialogue between himself, Achenbach, as a client, and people in the audience, the philosophical counselors, where Achenbach goes to talk about his life problems. And the life problem for Achenbach in this text is that he cannot write the text, or that he has difficulties in writing the text, and somehow seeks advice from the counselors in the room. So what Achenbach is trying to do is to show that there is a philosophical relevance, a methodological relevance of all this, in the sense that the philosophical text he's writing is a reflection of a very specific individual problem that Achenbach himself has, and which he tries to express in the text. He's not trying simply to talk about philosophical counseling in general, but he's trying to offer his particular specific individual singular problem and then to philosophize in this way. Moreover, by presenting this problem, he also more or less writes his text, so he solves it as well. So if the problem is, I cannot really, I have a writer's block, I cannot finish this text. By incorporating into the text his own particular problem, he starts to find solutions as well, and actually presents quite an interesting text eventually. Another problem for him and for his attempts to identify the philosophical traditions with which we can connect philosophical counseling is Kant. So he thinks that there is a way to link Kant's rehabilitation of the notion of wisdom, is the destiny of philosophy, with Kant's notion of the world. And he thinks that Kant's urgent question, why should we philosophize, should be answered according to the usefulness of philosophy, to an answer to the question of why philosophy would be useful, and hence the practical character that philosophy might have. And the idea is that as a theory of wisdom, philosophy would be the subject of the practical philosopher, who has to prove himself as a teacher of philosophy by teaching and by example. And only by doing so, he would be an actual philosopher. And that's, these are some of the things Kant says in his logic lectures on the nature of philosophy, and in his anthropology on the kind of job of the philosopher. He is also aware of the fact that wisdom is something that we achieve on our own. It's not that something that can be granted by the counselor, so the counselor can enable the counselee in the search for knowledge, but cannot simply provide wisdom. Now, the problem he has with Kant is that he thinks that the Kantian terms should be corrected in order to properly describe the tasks of philosophical practice. And he thinks that Nietzsche is the philosopher who can do that. He thinks that Nietzsche preeminently took up and perfected the tradition of an understanding of wisdom that was opened up by Montaigne and today guides philosophical practice. And Achenbach finds lacking in Kant precisely the practical character of philosophy which the ancients cultivated. And he thinks those are expressed in Nietzsche's aphorisms. And he says that if we compare Kant and Schopenhauer to Plato, Spinoza, Pascal, well, he quotes here Nietzsche, Rousseau and Goethe, concerning their soul and not their mind, it is to the disadvantage of Kant and Schopenhauer. Because their thoughts don't represent the passionate history of the soul. There is no novel, no crisis, no catastrophe, and no death hour to be guessed. In other words, this connection to the lived life, according to Nietzsche, is missing to a greater extent in Kant and Schopenhauer than it is in Plato, Spinoza, Pascal, Rousseau, and Goethe. And again, the wisdom of the philosophical counselor is what it means today to live philosophically. And Nietzsche says, we think that one should have lived totally unphilosophically in today's terms, especially not as a shy man of virtue, in order to judge the big problems from experience. The wise man has far too long been confused with the scientific person, and even longer with a higher religious one. So what attracts Achenbach to Nietzsche is this idea of philosopher as a practical, not scientific thinker. And he thinks that Nietzsche presents very well the insufficiency, if not falsity, of all general statements about human beings. Instead, he thinks human beings are real as particular individuals. And according to Nietzsche, the generally poor success of the teachers of morality was due to the fact that they all too easily attempted to put up rules for everybody. And of course, that's a reference, implicit reference to Kant as well. So for Achenbach, the task of philosophical practice is to raise this question, and it belongs to its wisdom that it has to find an answer anew in any singular particular case. Finally, Achenbach concludes this kind of narrative into the history of philosophy with two quotations from Ernst Bloch. He says, "Wisdom is a characteristic as unobtrusive as it is unavoidable of a learned and unified practical philosophy. There have to be wise persons in order to prevent a movement from becoming routine and practicistic." Okay, so what we have here is a particular conception of philosophical counseling as going back to the initial notion of philosophy as distinct from academic philosophy. And this has some methodological implications. As I mentioned, to make them more visible, Achenbach uses a particular style in his text, kind of particular dialogue he has with the philosophical counselors in the audience. However, what I would like to do next, and in the final part of the talk, is to examine some methodological implications of this account of philosophical counseling, where, again, the emphasis will be put on the practical character of philosophical counseling. So if philosophical practice is supposed to focus on the life problems of specific individuals, groups, or institutions, then its approach should be distinct from the approach of academic philosophy, where the problems discussed are expected to be of universal relevance. And significant for the approach in philosophical counseling would be the relation between counselor and counselee. And that relation would need a lot of trust if genuine communication is to obtain. And this genuine communication is needed if the counselor and counselee are to be able to examine specific singular life problems of the counselee. In other words, the risk is that the counselee will come and present some specific problems they have, and the counselor, through the knowledge they have of philosophy, might miss the specificity of the problems because they would think that what the counselee has is some kind of general problem that the philosopher, academic philosopher, is usually familiar with. And they might miss precisely the specific problem that the counselee raises. So if we are to be able to focus on the singular problem of the counselee, the problem which is relevant for the life of the counselee, what we need to do is precisely to step back from the philosophical framework with which we are familiar, perhaps also from other frameworks with which we are familiar, and to try to engage in a relation based on trust with the counselee, precisely in order to hear them and to hear the specific problems they voice, rather than attributing to them a particular interpretation of the problem according to our conceptual framework. And an appropriate approach in philosophical practice for that is the so-called dialogue-based learning approach. This was introduced by a philosophical counselor called Maria Badenza-Tillmans. It has a philosophical background, Martin Buber's influential work, I and Thou, where the focus is not on one individual or group or institution and their problem, but on the relation between counselor and counselee. And again, the relation is not primarily one of understanding, but one of authentic engagement with the other. So engaging authentically with the other excludes a couple of traditional ways of connecting to another person. it excludes trying to understand the person by trying to understand their context. So if you try to understand the person, first inquiring, okay, where did you live? And so you might miss what is specific for this individual. Trying to understand also a person through a pre-given categorical framework is also to be avoided, such as diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, which is used in psychotherapy. I'm aware that
maybe if we finish at 4, that works for you.
Yeah, I'll try to be even quicker. So the attempt to avoid this perception of the other through a particular framework is needed in order to capture the specific otherness of the counselee, of the other. If we understand the other through our own particular framework, we might reduce them to ourselves, and that's something to be avoided according to this approach. What we want is to capture this specific otherness of the other, which is not reducible, again, to a particular theory or to a particular account. And that connects it to that practical knowledge that Achenbach was talking about, the knowing how or the knowing about. It is that which also is favored by the insights that can be developed through the connection between the counselor and the counselee, with the help of philosophy, of course. It is that wisdom which enables the counselor to hear what the problem of the counselee is and to be able to guide the counselee. So let me draw some conclusions. So in the first part of the talk, I drew a distinction between philosophical practice and academic philosophy. And an important point of contrast was that between the universality of the problems of academic philosophy and the singularity of the problems of philosophical practice, where counselees will bring their specific problems from their own lives. Now, Achenbach's understanding of the helping practical character of philosophical practice was clarified through his view of the practical nature of philosophical practice as an effort for the counselee to achieve practical wisdom through obtaining insights, which are at the same time insights that transform the counselee. After a discussion of the philosophical traditions influencing Achenbach's philosophical practice, I focused on the methodological implications. And I said that in order for the insights of the counselee to be wisdom conducive, they need to be the counselee's own insights in response to her own problems. So methodologically, this places emphasis on the relation between the counselor and the counselee, a relation that is not primarily based on understanding, but relies on trust. And this doesn't only seem to retrieve a practical aspect of philosophy, as initially practiced in ancient traditions, but also seems to lead to a diversity of philosophical issues and methodologies, which challenge the canon, not only by encouraging distinct voices in their approach to the problems discussed by the canon, but also encourage new problems and approaches in their singular diversity. So the idea is that through philosophical counseling, through its practical aspect, through hearing the specific problems of the individual and through philosophizing on the basis of those problems, we end up with new philosophical problems distinct from the traditional problems of the canon, and also with new approaches and methodologies. Okay, just to end, consider Kant's idea of cosmopolitan right. The general requirement here is that states and individuals have the right to attempt to establish relations with other states and their citizens, but not a right to enter and colonize foreign territory. States have the right to refuse visitors, but not violently, and not if it leads to their destruction. That's Kant's idea of cosmopolitan right. The third part of right, apart from the right of a nation and international right. So perhaps the conception of cosmopolitan philosophy, constructed by analogy with cosmopolitan right, and against the background of the discussion above on philosophical practice, would offer a promising response to calls for a renewal of philosophical thought and practice, both to make it more impactful in the right way, but also to become more welcoming of distinct voices and traditions in a way which preserves the proper rigor and significance of philosophy. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Florence. So we'll take a 10-minute break. So 4:10 we'll continue with Q&A. Thank you. Here or this? Yeah, everything off here.